Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. This is Against Carceral Communism for Abolition Communism by Simon Magsalin, who is an anarchist in the archipelago known as the Philippines, an online archivist and librarian, and an abolitionist organizer. This text is dedicated to the communists who are abolitionists and the abolitionists who are communists. Section 1, Against Carceral Communism. While the anarchist and abolitionist exclaim, "ACAB, all cops are bad," the pitiful spectacle of the carceral communist would amend, "ACAB," with drivel saying it's ACCAB, all capitalist cops are bad. They continue, "Socialist cops are not bad because they are proletarian in character and protect the proletarian state." Such convolution is mistaken in its belief that police can somehow have a proletarian character, when historically the institutions of policing and incarceration were established to cement the rule of capital over proletarians. Not to mention that the notion that socialist cops protect common goods against criminal or counter-revolutionary elements is identical in content to bourgeois police apologia. Likely, nobody would identify as a carceral communist, much like nobody would identify as a carceral feminist. Both carceral communists exist. Carceral communists are the people who would defend mass incarceration and deportations under the former Soviet Unions and in the current People's Republic of China. Carceral communists merely oppose these police and prisons and wish to propose their own people's police and prisons. Carceral communism is a marriage of a spectacular image of communism with carcerality. By spectacular, we mean in the sense of Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, where the real is substituted by reified images of the false. Meanwhile, carcerality is the logic of the systems of policing and incarceration. A spectacular image of communism is the images and aesthetics of communist states, righteous people's armies, waving red flags, and tightly planned economies. This spectacular image of communism is not communism itself, it is merely a false image of it, a spectacle. Ultimately, the spectacle presents this false image of communism to obscure what communism actually means in practice. The movement to abolish the current state of things. In a certain sense, this spectacular image is already infused with carcerality from the 1917 Russian Revolution onward, where communists thought that carcerality could be used for proletarian ends, abolishing only the bourgeois statesmen but retaining all other features of capitalist society. Carceral communism has so far been the main narrative of communism. States from the former Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, other socialist states, and their aligned Western parties. After the Bolshevik coup during the Russian Revolution, the party of Lenin constituted secret police, the Cheka, and even set up their headquarters at Lubyanka, built on the same site as the secret police of Tsarina Catherine, while the revolutionary upsurge emptied the Tsar's prison and forced labor camps. The party of Lenin reconstituted these as gulags, which Stalin would later inherit, to incredibly bloody effect. Carceral communists such as Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin may have opposed the Tsar's police and prisons, but only for the sake of their own institutions of oppression. What Lenin and the Bolsheviks failed to realize is that communism is intrinsically a movement of proletarians struggling to abolish their class. By reconstituting communist police and prisons, the Bolsheviks merely produced institutions of proletarianization and all that entailed. Bolshevik communism merely universalized the proletarian condition instead of its abolition, and marred this proletarianization with the spectacular image of communism. ACAB means communist cops too. Abolition means abolish communist police and prisons. When the question, who polices, is posed, the abolition group Critical Resistance identifies right-wing and fascist militias as those who take part in policing in the so-called United States. Here in the Philippines, fascist and right-wing militias do take part in policing, but there is also a para-state entity that espouses communism while reproducing carcerality, the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, and their armed wing, the New People's Army, NPA. In Nettie Wild's 1988 documentary about the communist movement, A Rustling of Leaves Inside the Philippine Revolution, Party Cater and Guerrilla Front had to deal with a young man who defected from the NPA. The young man, codenamed Batman in the documentary, was ordered by his uncle in a right-wing militia to defect from the NPA and provide intel for the military. Batman was eventually recaptured by the NPA, while the cadre who captured Batman made a show of giving the local community a voice in the trial of Batman in a people's court. The NPA headquarters found the people's verdict unsatisfactory. In the end, the NPA cadre were ultimately Batman's judges, jury, and executioners. It mattered little that Batman was coerced into defecting. The cadre decided that he should die, and that was that. Then, in the 90s, the CPP-NPA detained hundreds of its own cadre and systematically tortured and executed scores of them in what became known as the anti-infiltration purges. The CPP-NPA were not actually infiltrated by government agents, but by the time the cadre found out, hundreds were already executed, and mass graves are still being found today. Survivors are still tagged as counter-revolutionaries by the CPP up to today. More recently, after the 2016 elections, which saw the fascist Rodrigo Duterte win the presidency, the CPP-NPA wholeheartedly backed Duterte's war on drugs, with the NPA even conducting their own drug raids in support of Duterte's fascist agenda. In all three of these cases, it is clear that even without taking state power, communist movements can reproduce carceral logic to lethal conclusions. Abolition in the Philippines will also mean abolishing New People's Army alongside the Philippine National Police, the military, and paramilitary groups. Even anarchists are not immune to reproducing carcerality. There have been moments where revolutionary anarchists in the Spanish and Ukrainian revolutions reproduced policing with militants of the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, even operating a concentration camp for fascists. More recently, we have seen carcerality reproduced in radical projects like the Chapel Hill Occupy protest, or CHOP. There, individuals took it upon themselves to act as the New People's Police, shot and killed black teens. It matters not if the anarcho concentration camp was leagues better than the Stalinist gulags, or if the anarcho police are somehow better. Abolition means the doing away of the anarcho police and anarcho prisons as well. What explains the endurance of carcerality among supposedly communist movements? Even for radicals, the ideology of police and prisons presents itself as natural, even inevitable. In this sense, carcerality is similar to Mark Fisher's conception of capitalist realism from the book by the same name. While the perspective of capitalist realism constantly propagandizes that there is no alternative to capitalism, capitalist realism has only been generalized with the fall of so-called actually existing socialism. In comparison, carcerality has presented itself as natural long before, to the point where Bolsheviks considered it only natural that the dictatorship of the proletariat necessarily includes police and prisons. As Fisher argued, emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. The truth of the matter is that carcerality is historically contingent. It did not always exist, nor has it always been generalized to exist everywhere. In the Philippines, carcerality was introduced with colonialism. In the United States, it was introduced with slave patrols. In Europe, it was implemented to control the working class. Carcerality has always meant the social control of the proletarianized. The term carceral capitalism is redundant, for capitalism cannot exist without carcerality. Capitalism needs carcerality to allow the enforcement of wage labor. This is the key contribution in The Anarchy of Colored Girls Assembled in a Righteous Manner by Saidiya Hartman, where black women who resisted working had to be criminalized by the state under the vagrancy laws to enforce the regime of proletarianization upon them. That the Bolsheviks found nothing wrong with combining their spectacular image of communism with the false realism of carcerality allowed the reconstruction of a bourgeois society in communist aesthetics. A society without carcerality was inconceivable for the Bolsheviks, just as it was impossible for them to imagine a world without authority and the state. Without prison and police abolition, communists will never transcend capitalist ideology. Section 2. For Abolition Communism. In her 2014 article against carceral feminism, the anarchist and abolitionist Victoria Law described carceral feminism as an approach that sees increased policing, prosecution, and imprisonment as the primary solution to violence against women. End quote. In short, carceral feminism is the idea that cops and prisons can keep women safe, yet, as Victoria shows, women and queer folk are often subjected to police violence when they call on police to help and are at times themselves incarcerated. Abolitionists understand that police and prisons do not keep women safe and instead exacerbate harm. Against carceral feminism is an abolition feminism that struggles for the abolition of policing and the incarceration and argues for measures such as transformative justice that can keep women safe. In a certain sense, carceral communism is alike with carceral feminism in its unwavering belief that systems of policing and incarceration can be used benevolently. It cannot. That is to say, carceral communism is the belief that police and prisons are compatible or even necessary for communism. Just as carceral feminism is incompatible with feminism due to exacerbating violence against feminized bodies, carceral communism is wholly incompatible with a coherent vision of communism. Police and prisons cannot possibly be communized, proletarianized, decolonized, indigenized, or what have you, as these are features that are ultimately tied up with the development of capitalism and the modern state system, and are features of capitalist society that proletarianizes. In the Philippines, as in many parts of the world, police and prisons are instruments of colonization and counterinsurgency up to the day indigenous communities feel that prisons divest their communities of true justice. Communist measures require the abolition of police and prisons. Communism is ultimately a movement that abolishes the current state of things, that things being the constant proletarianization that marks us as proles in this capitalist world. Because communism is the self-abolition of the proletariat, Communist measures are activities and actions that attack proletarianization. Thus, abolition steps that assault policing and incarceration are ultimately communist measures. Proletarianization is ultimately a social relation imposed by capital and is the class distinction that distinguishes the proletariat. As a social relation, proletarianization is the imposition of wage labor, the imposition of work as a separate field of human activity, and the alienation from their fruits of their production. Proletarianization is a hierarchical condition of domination where capital, the state, and the ruling class dominate the proletariat. In their 2020 booklet, Our Communities, Our Solution, an organizer's toolkit for developing campaigns to abolish policing, Critical Resistance defines policing as a social relationship made up by a set of practices that are empowered by the state to enforce law and social control through the use of force, end quote. As a social relation, Critical Resistance points out that policing, quote, reinforces oppressive dynamics, end quote, such as slavery, segregation, and racism, and enforces compliance among criminalized communities. It is in this sense that policing is also a social relation that reinforces proletarianization. The proletarianized have always been a criminalized class. Witness the difference in policing among different classes. If a worker steals food, they are sent to prison, but if bosses steal from workers, usually nothing at all happens for wage theft. It is a daily occurrence. It is in this way that policing forms part of proletarianization. Keeping the proles in line has always been the function of policing since it was invented. Indeed, whether in bourgeois or communist states, the police have always been used to combat militant proletarians. This is indeed the case in imperialized countries, whether in the Philippines or in former Soviet Poland, whether it be the Mendiola massacre in the Philippines or the harsh suppression of Solidarność in Soviet Poland, the same regime of carcerality reigns. As radical traditions, abolition arose from the black radical condition, while communism from the European proletarian milieu. Both abolition and communism share roots among dominated classes, one enslaved and the other proletarianized. While anti-state communists have always had implicitly an abolitionist consciousness in their desire to eliminate policing and incarceration, the fusing of communism and abolition has rarely been articulated. To talk of an abolition communism is in a way a redundancy, because regimes of policing and incarceration could not possibly exist in a society that has done away with classes and the state. After all, both abolition and communism aim to abolish the current order and establish a qualitatively different kind of life. In this way, abolition and communism are alike. However, because communist politics has become imbued with carcerality for more than a century, it becomes necessary to explicitly articulate a communism that wholly rejects carceral logic. Counterpoised to carceral communism, abolition communism necessarily opposes the tradition of carcerality within communist thought and necessarily opposes the carcerality of communist states. To paraphrase Bobby Seale, we do not fight carcerality with carcerality. We oppose carceral capitalism not with carceral communism, but with abolition communism. Mao once said that without a people's army, the people have nothing, end quote. Yet counterbalancing the new people's army against the Philippine National Police does nothing for liberation if both institutions reproduce carcerality. Qualitatively new forms of social relations that break with carcerality is needed to definitively combat policing and incarceration. What was once presented as necessary and inevitable must be shown to be mere contingency, and what was once impossible must be shown to be attainable. communist states considered it necessary to institute carcerality to protect proletarian gains, but this is illusionary. To paraphrase Gilles Dauvet, to think that proletarian police and prisons are necessary to combat bourgeois police and prisons is to think of the proletariat in bourgeois terms. In doing so, one introduces everything that the insurrectionary movement had overwhelmed. The institutions that a proletariat in abolition builds cannot possibly look like a bourgeois society. To reinstitute carcerality is to reconstruct bourgeois society within the spectacular image of communism. That the carcerality of communist states are mere mirrors of the carcerality of the bourgeois society is proof enough of their embourgeoisement. How communism deals with harm cannot possibly take the bourgeois forms of police and prisons, else this is not communism at all. Abolition communism is not a qualitatively new form of communism, but rather an integration of abolitionist and communist consciousness. Abolition communism is the idea that communist measures must simultaneously be abolitionist steps. This does not mean that abolitionist steps, such as the defunding of police and decarceration of prisoners, are necessary communist measures, though these steps do make communist organizing under capitalism easier. Rather, communist measures implemented by abolitionist communists dismantle systems of policing and incarceration simultaneous to dismantling wage labor, the state, work, etc., precisely because policing and incarceration are central to the rule of capital. The freeing of the prisoners and the setting fire to the prisons does more for the proletariat than 100 programs. While abolitionist communists such as Angela Davis can articulate a vision of police and a prison abolition as a state divorced from carcerality, abolitionists who are also anarchists understand that carcerality is part and parcel to the state system itself. Anarchists are under no illusion that state power and monopoly of violence can be used benevolently. It is idealism to think that with the right people in charge of the state's police and prisons, that these will cease to be maleficent, or that the state can peacefully dismantle peace in prisons, just as violence, the very raison d'etre of the state, and there has never been a non-violent state. To deprive the state of its articles of violence fulfills the old communist prophecy. The proletariat abolishes itself as a class, and in doing so abolishes the state as state. If communists cannot then indulge in fantasies of lining up capitalists onto walls to shoot them, or to incarcerate them en masse in re-education gulags, what then? Instead of mass executions and mass incarceration, abolition communism takes seriously the task of excarceration. If decarceration is the reduction of the number of incarcerated bodies by setting them free, excarceration is the doing away with imprisonment, policing, and carcerality altogether. Excarceration includes measures such as transformative justice, harm reduction, and community accountability that can build strong communities capable of dealing with harm in a healthy way. Excarceration potentially becomes the means by which proletarians in abolition deal with harm, as opposed to using inherently bourgeois forms like policing and incarceration. And the third part will be in another video with some further analysis. Please follow and share.